Hi, welcome to our continued focus on the connection between first language orthography and the processes that students use to read. And of course, the reason that we're paying attention to this is because when English language learners are in your classroom, if they've been exposed to print in any way in their first language, they have already started to make some guesses about how to make sense of that print. They might already have started to learn to read it. Perhaps they've mastered reading in that print, in that orthography. And so their eyes and their minds are already kind of trained to read in a certain way. And it may or may not match up well with the way we read in English. So the reason that we're paying attention to this is that we need to, yet again, understand where our particular students are coming from, where their challenges or their strengths are, so that we can build on those strengths and we can fill in any missing gaps that students have. So, understanding the first language print literacy, understanding how much they've learned and how that print literacy works, really, really key. And so that's where we're picking up today. So last week, what we were focusing on is we were taking a look at just how different languages work, and you were building up lots of words, lots of vocabulary around orthography, like logographic, syllabic, alphabetic. We were talking about low-level transfer, which means when students bring what they know to be true about how print is read in their first language and they attempt to apply it in their second language. And notice that it uses the word transfer, so it's almost like being able to use it. One thing I want you to know is that some of those ideas will match with English, and some of them will not. And when they match, we always call it transfer. And if you took second language acquisition, you'll remember that when those ideas don't match as well, we call it interference. Okay? Now, last week's chapter, the Birch chapter, one of the last things that she said, it's the only thing I don't like about the chapter, but one of the last things she said is that because language print literacies are so different from each other, and English is so far off the scale in terms of being so opaque, so many exceptions, that really there's less that students at the low level can transfer in from their first language. Now, what I don't want is I don't want you to get the idea that that means that what students bring with them is a problem. Everything they can do in reading is actually a resource. And so what I want to do for a moment is just contextualize this a little bit. Yes, with low-level transfer, it's true that less of what they bring with them, say for example they're Arabic speakers or they are Russian speakers, there's less that they can bring with them that they can transfer right over. But low-level transfer is one tiny part of a really complex big puzzle of what it is that we do when we read. So there's all of this, and low-level transfer is just this part. So yes, it's true that the first language print literacy, it's just as likely to bring in some issues as it is to bring in some assistance, but everything, all the other dimensions that we're going to take a look at make it worth the wait that students come in with a developed language. So let's say that you head off to teach first grade and you've got immigrant parents in the classroom. Please encourage them to teach their children to read in the first language. Be reading to them. Have them look over your shoulder when you're writing a recipe down for someone, or when you're making a grocery list in the first language. So lots and lots of exposure. It will help in so many ways. Not so much with low-level transfer, not so much. Birch is right about that, but the payoff is so amazing with everything else. So, okay, so that said, another thing I wanted to do, I love big ideas, I love the big picture. I wanted to talk just about how education moves a little bit. So you probably already have realized this, but in education, it's like there's a pendulum, and it swings back and forth. We really like extremes. We tend to go in the 80s to one extreme, and then in the aughts to another extreme, and then the 20s we'll be off and back to the original. So we just keep going back and forth, back and forth. The reason I bring this up is that one pendulum that we've already talked about in both second language acquisition and in methods is we've talked about the top-down and the bottom-up approach to teaching a language. So bottom up are those little tiny pieces, the individual words, the individual punctuation, how to pronounce things, grammar, all of those little tiny Lego building blocks. Top down, how a narrative works, how a conversation, a polite conversation, borrowing something tends to work, that kind of thing. So the bigger picture, the main idea of a reading, that is top down. So what we've done, including in TESOL, is we've moved back and forth on this pendulum. We've moved from bottom up to top down to more interactive, right? That's where we are, because if you've taken a few ESLG courses already, you've been exposed to Pat Carroll's name, that she said, okay, the duel is on. Which one is better, top down, bottom up, or doing both? And of course what she found was doing both, and that's what she named interactive methods. So we've gone like this. And so for many, many years, when we were really focused on top-down only, and in K-12 that looked like whole language, we were ignoring things like low-level transfer. We weren't paying attention to these little building blocks. And so we're more in the middle now. The pendulum is right now more in the middle. And so it's a good time to also be paying attention to these little tiny building blocks, like how someone who's learned another alphabet, how learning English, what does that pathway look like, and how can you support them? Okay, so those are some big pictures. What are we going to do? This lecture is going to be a little bit shorter. I think the biggest thing that I'm going to do is to set you up for success as you head to the research articles that you're going to now. And yes, I said research articles. We'll talk about that in a moment. So the big picture I'm going to talk about is the relationship between orthography and reading processes. And there's a bunch of terms down here. They're not just down here so that you can see them. They're also here as an assistance to me so I don't forget to talk about them. So we're going to talk more about, instead of talking about orthographies, we're going to talk about, so what's it going to look like in your third grade classroom next year? Or what's it going to look like with your beginning adult language learners who are newly arrived refugees, right? So we're going to talk about what are some of the tools you could use. And that's where these things come in, so I remember to mention them. So after we talk about this big picture, including some of the tools that you might find helpful to kind of bridge these pieces, then I'm going to end by telling you how to read a research article and survive. So why are we reading research articles? If you've started in the program a while ago, you're probably thinking to yourself, wait a minute, she's never made us read a research article before. Here's the thing. The information that you're getting in this course is so unique. Other teachers in your building, even other teachers who've done an ELL endorsement elsewhere, are likely going to be missing a lot of these pieces. And so this is a chance for you to really advocate for English language learners and to actually educate your colleagues. And this is where research articles come in, because once you step up to the plate to be a teacher educator, there's a responsibility on you, and that is to make sure that you're keeping up with what research is finding out. So really nerdy people like me, we design research studies, we go out and we do them, and then we spend incredibly long periods of time, years for me, taking our time to write up those results and then publishing them. And so, but we're not up to no good, we're up to real good. We're up to finding out what is it, given our constructs, given the things that we know right now, what is it that's true about English language learners and about them in the world? And so you need access to that, and now is a great time for you to kind of start that out, try it out, and the big picture, I want you to know that you don't have to understand all of it to understand the most significant pieces, and I'll explain a little bit more about that. Now for this lecture, there's actually a 2-page handout that I'd like you to have access to, either print it out, and there is some color, I don't know if that's problematic for you, or to have up on an iPad, or be pausing the lecture and to be taking a look at it. But there's some pieces that are going to be really helpful to me in talking through with you, okay, including what are the parts of a research article. Okay, so the place I want to begin in talking about orthography and reading processes is let's just talk about when my kids went off to their first day of preschool or their first day of kindergarten. What did they walk in with, and what were they learning from the teacher? So my kids would have understood, they would have had real life experiences with an animal that looks a lot like this, right? That they have heard us call many, many times a cat. And notice I've written this actually in IPA, the International Phonetic Alphabet. So, and I put it in parentheses as if it's something said. So my kids would have walked into preschool having real life experience of what this is, and having already attached an oral label to it, cat, right? So they've walked in with that. What are they getting from the teacher? They're getting how this looks in print, okay? So now they're adding this piece. And while they're learning how this works, because English is an alphabetic language, the teachers are going to be working really hard to make a connection. That marker really doesn't work well. Let me grab another one. To make a connection between these things, right? So what does it start with? K, right? K. How does it end? T, t, cat, t, t. Right? So they're really trying to build up and firm that connection between the way it is said, the oral label, and the way that it looks. Okay. So let's say when my youngest, Thor, heads off to preschool, when he went off to preschool, let's say that sitting next to him in preschool is an English language learner who has not had very much experience with the English language. So that child walks in with this, they've got real world experiences, maybe they have this animal at home, and the teacher might be expecting students to be able to label this, and my son Thor, this is knowledge he's walking in with, but this might be new information for that English language learner, right? So that child is attempting to place an oral label on this at the same time that the child is placing a print label on this as well, and that print label looks like this. And so I wanted to start just by, and we'll pick this up in another unit when we talk about what happens when you don't have print literacy built up in the first language, but I just kind of wanted you just for a moment to think about how different that experience is around print for the native English speaking child and for the non-native child who hasn't built up that basic everyday vocabulary yet, right? And so just to realize that my child is adding this print label, and probably by that point already has a sense that there's going to be some kind of connection here, right? And for that English language learner, they are busy trying to add both of these, but this cannot be assumed. And so trying to build an alphabetic understanding of how to write this label based on what is assumed knowledge is kind of faulty territory. So I just kind of wanted to start there. And part of what we're going to do is we're going to talk about, okay, so how do students from different orthographies, how do they make sense of reading? How do they connect these pieces, right? And that's on your handout as well. I've got those. So they've got the phoneme, how it's said. They've got the thing, right? The idea or the noun, the thing. And then they've got the grapheme, how it's written. So for someone in an alphabetic language, right? Someone in an alphabetic language, then they are going to make a really strong connection in their memory between the phoneme and the grapheme. So when they say this, they will probably also be saying this to themselves in their heads. Or if they're a new reader, they'll actually be saying it. So for my kids, as native English speakers, as they head off to an English environment preschool, when they see this, they're learning to say this, which gives them access to what it means. So they're unlocking the grapheme with the phoneme and quickly bringing up what it means, right? So what about a student who has learned to read in a logographic language? How does that work? Well, in a logographic language, you now know the phoneme and the grapheme have nothing to do with each other. They're random. So random that, say, Mandarin Chinese has completely, even though it's written, it has the same graphemes as Cantonese and the other forms of Chinese, the phonemes are all different, right? It's that random, completely random. There's no connection. So that student would, when they see the grapheme, the connection that they would probably make, the strongest connection is the thing itself. They're not going to have the same relationship in their reading process to the phoneme that the alphabetic reader or the syllabic reader is going to have. So I kind of want to kind of anchor you with that, both to pick up where we left off from last week, but also kind of moving forward, is that there's a very different relationship that comes about. Okay. Some other things that I'd like to talk about is I'd like to talk about, with those processes, and we talked about them just a little bit last time, how students, the kinds of processes that they would use. And this is also on your handout. I've got all at once, and I've got phonemic decoding. I'm not off the board, nope. Right, so we'll start there and then we'll add a third one. If you have learned to read in a logographic language, you have developed what's called all-at-once processing. You see the grapheme on the page and boom, you apply the meaning, right? So we're back to, it's too bad I erased it, but you're back to the grapheme and the, of, in English, cat, but whatever it is in, say, Mandarin, and then the thing itself, the image of the cat. So what comes up for you is that image. All-at-once processing is you see it and you instantly are able to access that meaning. Phonemic decoding would happen for an alphabetic and a syllabic language, either one. This is logographic. Okay. And with phonemic decoding, what would happen is what would happen, for example, with my son Thor when he headed off to preschool. So he learns that when a new word, once he's tackled the alphabet, the sounds, and he's built up a little bit of reading skill, when he's presented with a new word he hasn't seen before, doesn't mean he doesn't know the word, but rather he hasn't seen it in print before, he can take it apart, sound by sound, and then slowly put it back together. K-at, 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 cat. Oh, cat, right? That is phonemic decoding. You actually access what the thing means from the grapheme to the phoneme and then to the meaning, right? And so what comes up is the meaning, but it comes by taking it apart. Now, I said alphabetic and syllabic languages can be phonemically decoded. That's the processing that students carry out. Instead of all at once, they're breaking it down into pieces. But of course, we learned that there's two kinds of alphabetic languages, right? And in the articles that you'll read this time, it's called orthographic depth. How's that for? Use that at the next party you go to. That will impress people. Orthographic depth. And that's a fancy way of saying those two terms we mastered last time, transparent and opaque. Transparent and opaque. So if your alphabet is transparent, and that's what I'm writing right now, if your alphabet is transparent, then this is the way that your brain, your eye would tackle a word. You would tackle it piece by piece until you've got it. Only if your alphabet is mostly transparent. You can really, really count on it. So, for example, if that is always pronounced s, that's transparent, right? If sometimes it's sh, sometimes it's something else, sometimes it's silent, that is not transparent. So English, of course, is alphabetic, but it's the naughty kind of alphabetic. It's the opaque. And so you end up with this other option. So I'm going to put opaque, alphabetic. And I could put opaque, syllabic, but syllabic systems tend to be far less naughty than English. And so I'm not writing opaque syllabic, but technically that could go there as well. And I just don't know syllabic languages as well as maybe I should to be able to say which category they would really fall into most of the time. But what you have here is you have two things going on. So my son Thor, when he heads off to preschool and he has experiences with cats and he's heard us say the word cat and he says the word cat, and then he shows up and the teacher shows him how to unlock this written word of C-A-T by sounding it out. And that one actually mostly makes sense. The vowel's a little iffy, the ah sound, but it doesn't say its name. But other than that, it pretty much follows what we would expect. So he is able to use phonemic decoding. Right? But then he encounters words like island. Let me write that up there. Right? So I used the example of this letter, and I said if this letter is always pronounced S, then you have a transparent alphabet. But here's a great example that in English, S does not always say S. Sometimes it's silent, like here in island, right? And so my son Thor has learned that although phonemic decoding will get him pretty far down the road with reading in English, it won't get him all the way home. That he has to use something else. He actually has to read some all-at-once, he has to use some all-at-once processing to make his way through our very opaque alphabet. So, we've got all at once here. And and this is really, really important for you to see, one of the things is kind of a bright note, that wherever your students are coming from, no matter what the L1 print orthography is, no matter what it is, we can put it to work in English, right? We can find a way to make it work, because if they learn to read in a logographic language and they've used all-at-once processing, well, good news. English is so opaque. We do use all-at-once processing. We do, and especially Thor, as a 5th grader, doesn't still stare at his book and say, k-at, cat, right? He does recognize words on sight now. And once you start doing that, you're starting to use all-at-once processing. So, okay, so this is a little bit, I'm going to complicate it just a little bit. Even super transparent alphabetic and syllabic languages, even their phonemic decoding, master readers, once they become really, really fast at reading, they too they're not sounding things out, right? They are on site, they are coming up with what the meaning is and moving on. So just to complicate things a little bit. But we're not talking about master readers here most of the time. What we're talking about is we're talking about people who are still developing. Okay. So, so let's talk about what are some of the issues that students might have as they're coming into your classroom, whether they're child learners or adult learners. And I've got this kind of list of things that you might encounter. I'm not really sure what order I want to go into, but if, for example, if you have a student who has learned to read in a logographic language, then one thing that you would find really, really helpful to help you give evidence to a student, you can't actually see me if I stand over there, to give evidence to a student of how English works, and for them to begin seeing evidence again and again that when a word begins with this, they most of the time can count on you saying the P sound, right? Not all the time, like philosophy, not all the time, but most of the time. So using big books or big texts and a pointer, because it's not just enough, especially for those who are coming from a logographic language, and really struggling with figuring out this phonemic processing in English. It's not enough for you to just point at which line you're on, but rather each word. Some of you might be placed with Louisa or Monica in the Adult Language Center, the Adult Learning Center at Monroe, and they're working with adults who have never learned to read before in their first language, and they use some of the strategies that are coming up today, and we'll talk about them in another unit. But one of the strategies they use is when students write, they write on poster board, and it goes at the front, and they're actually given a pointer and asked to point out each word as they're saying it, so that there's more evidence for those who are still struggling to figure out how they can phonemically decode words and how that phoneme system works. Big books, big text, and a pointer can really make a difference. Okay. Other things. Okay, let's talk about handwriting stroke order. So one thing you might not have thought about too much before today, maybe before you saw the handouts, is that English is written in a certain stroke order. And you actually would have been taught this in preschool or kindergarten or first grade. You would have been exposed to information charts where it's got, like, if it's got a K, it's got arrows showing you which parts of the letter to make at what point. We master that quickly, we never think about it again. So we don't think about the stroke order of English. But on the handout, I've got some examples for you there. Let's take a look. I've got an example of English, right? And as you take a look at English, you see that in general, we start strokes at the top and we move down. And not always, but in general, it looks like sometimes we're moving to the left and sometimes we're moving to the right. And it looks like you make strokes on the left before you make strokes on the right, okay? Now, different languages, especially logographic languages, so we've got some examples there, right? They have a very different stroke order. Sometimes starting out, moving in, sometimes moving bottom, moving top, that kind of thing. And so one thing for you to think about for your students coming from logographic languages is you might need to spend a little bit more time with them on stroke order. Help them understand the slightly different stroke order of English. And I spent maybe just a few seconds on Google Images looking for different stroke order kind of charts that teachers use. If it just took me a few seconds, it won't take you long at all to find that out about your students' first languages, especially if they're logographic. So far we've talked about big books and using a pointer. We've talked about talking about stroke order with them. Another thing that can be of real help, especially if you have students coming from a logographic language, and this idea of an alphabetic language this is new stuff. So what we use with child learners in English who are native English speakers is that if we were to get up and walk to almost any kindergarten classroom, we would see posters around the room, and it might be individual, so we might see something like this. We might see A, and then we would see an apple, right? Okay? So people have big posters of these, or they have each individual letter, and it runs around the top of the room. It's environmental print. So what's the problem with that, with your English language learners who are coming from a logographic language, and this is new information? Well, one problem is that is not called apple, almost for sure, in their language. It's a different word that starts with a different letter, right? A different sound, rather. And so the problem is that for your English language learners, not just for the logographic learners, but those who are coming from a different alphabet or from a syllabic language, that we are actually steering our students wrong. They see this, they come up with a different sound, and they try to attach it to that grapheme, right? So, how do you fix that? Well, I can tell you what I did when I was working with a native Russian speaker. The child had learned a little bit to read and write in Russian, and so had mastered the Cyrillic alphabet, which was great, except I was having trouble getting him to really make sense of how English worked. So what I did was I made a kind of a large 8.5 by 14, something like that, sheet for him of the alphabet in English, uppercase and lowercase letters. But what I did was I found which words in Russian began with which sounds. And I looked to see what are the charts that Russian teachers are giving their students. And I used that kind of information to create a chart that in English made no sense at all, right? Apple, there was an apple, but it was in a completely different place on that chart. And so it was accessing his word, what came up for him. And there's a teacher, an early childhood education teacher who also was TESOL, named Karen Nemeth. And she developed a poster that's an alphabet poster you could have up in your room, and it's 5 different languages. It's got one picture for each, just like this, but the difference is, for these 5 languages, this image all starts, this thing starts with the same sound in all 5 languages. If you're interested in that, let me know, and I will give you the link. The problem with it for me is it's something like French, German, Spanish, and I forget what the other 2 languages are. And the problem with that is that we have other speakers in Spokane, and so it's not as relevant to me. But anyway, something for you to think about. So that's an alphabet poster, but multilingual. And just remember, this is actually very likely to lead your English language learners astray, right? Okay. So, other things. If your students are coming from a syllabic language, they need some work on your part. They need some evidence that vowels actually matter, that they are not just connected with a consonant and they don't have to give it much thought. You need them to start paying attention to vowels in ways that they have not yet. So you would want to give them lots of evidence: bit, bat, bet, just kind of those three examples. So those three words, they're the only difference between them, right? They're minimal pairs, as we've learned to say in other languages, in other courses. There's only one difference between them, and that difference is a vowel. So you would want to reach for words that the student has a real understanding of what they are. So bat, maybe they know baseball bat, right? I don't think, that's not very good. That doesn't look like a bat at all. But anyways, you kind of get that. Bit, so you've got a dog, right? With bared teeth, something like that. Anyways, so to help them, really give them evidence, because they're not going to just automatically believe you on this. They have to pay attention to vowels. And vowels really matter in English. And they are not automatically connected with the consonants that are around them, that they can differ greatly. So you would want to give them lots and lots of examples and activities showing them that vowels make a difference in words. If you are working with students who are coming from an alphabetic or a syllabic or a logographic language that reads, instead of reading from left to right, I'm trying to do it backwards for you, to go the other way, then one thing that they might struggle with is automaticity, fluency with their eye movement. So I can tell you what I've done. I haven't worked with a whole lot of students who are really struggling with that, but one thing that I did was I took a piece of cardboard and I cut out a place for a line of text, so approximately a line of text, so that you could only see a line of text from the beginning to the end. And then what I did was I put a star where the student was supposed to start reading, and then I put arrows to show, move your eye this way, right? Move your eye this way. And then when the student would read a text, he used this kind of card, would place it over the text, and then move it down the page as he went. And of course, Arabic starts at the top and moves to the bottom, so that wasn't a problem at all. Just automatically getting, and I think I even, as I remember, like I did something like this to remind him, your eye needs to go back to this side again. So anyway, so that was a real help to me, and so you might find that something like that and helping with retrain the eye around directionality might be of assistance as well. And then something else for us to think about is pronunciation. So students may really struggle with pronunciation, and you may see it coming up, and I'm going to put spelling here as well. And of course, if they're coming from a really transparent alphabetic language, coming into English with all of these silent S's, right, that's going to be part of their struggle. But also they might be coming from, if they're coming from a syllabic language, they may not be paying a whole lot of attention to vowels. They may be leaving them off. If they are coming from a syllabic language, that it's always consonant vowel, so consonant vowel, katakana, right? then that would mean that words never end in consonant sounds. And so you might see a spelling issue coming up in which students are leaving off the final consonant sound. So just something to think about. Be really alert to those differences, and a lot of them trace back to the type of logographic system that can show up in pronunciation and spelling. Okay, I think I am ready to move on. So where you're going to go from here is you're going to give it your best shot, I know you are, to read 3 research articles and then a really brief kind of chaser text that chases after the third one. And in each of these, what you are getting is not the most current research, but rather a really kind of an easy to kind of tackle and get a sense of what we have found so far around orthography and processing around reading. So the first article that you will read takes a look at what if students from these different kinds of languages, at least I think they look at logographic and alphabetic, what if they were given a text in English that had alternating case? What does that mean? Well, you remember case is uppercase and lowercase. So what if they, for example, the word the was written like this? And I know some of you send texts like this sometimes. So capital T, little h, capital E, and then the next letter would be small, right? And to go back and forth like this. So in other words, if you've learned to phonemic decode, and that's been your primary way of making sense, will this bother you very much? Will it get in the way of you understanding? Will it slow you down? How about if you come from a logographic language? If you come from a logographic language and you do all at once processing, is that going to cause very much problem? So that's the first article. The second article is also a comparison of different language groups. And then the third article is drilling in on one specific language, Spanish, coming into English, and taking a look at what are the spelling issues that English language learners whose first language is Spanish, they've learned to read in Spanish, what kinds of issues show up? And so it's kind of a nice way for you to walk into this, into research articles on this topic. So how to read a research article. First idea is you don't have to understand everything. Most of the time, even though I'm old, when I read a research article, most of the time I don't understand it either. Sometimes I don't even understand the title. Okay, so full disclosure, just because you don't understand all of it doesn't mean you don't understand some of the most important pieces. So if you look on the handout that I have there, oh, I left something out, I see, but I'll come back to it. If you look at the handout, I've got the key pieces of a research article there, and I'm going to walk you through each of these really briefly. And I would suggest that the first 10 times that you read a research article, and yes, indeed you do, that would include these 3, that you mark it up, right? Just label it for yourself. If you think about it, you labeling the article with the different parts, that's kind of putting you in the driver's seat, and it's showing what you already understand. It's also a great way for you to have your students tackle difficult reading, is to label the parts, label that discourse competence that they have. So the first thing that you'll encounter the title and the names of the authors, sometimes the universities that they're at, and then you're going to see a paragraph that may or may not be labeled as the abstract, but that's what it is. What's an abstract? It's a really tight summary about what you're going to read. It tells you what the topic is. It probably hints at why this matters. It probably will tell you what kind of research was carried out, like did it happen in Korea? Was it 50 participants? Were they interviewed? What happened? And usually, but not always, it tells you what was found, right? So if you stop and think about it, if the abstract is pretty good, if it's been written pretty well by the author, you've just been given the answer to the test right there, right? Okay, so you never want to start reading an article without reading the abstract. That's ground zero for you. That's the place where you want to begin. What you will see after the abstract, and often these things are not labeled, but I'm giving you the power to label them, is the introduction. And the introduction brings up the topic and basically says, why does it matter? Why should I go to all the trouble of writing this 20-page article about this particular thing? So you find out there. After the introduction, after the author has said what matters, the next thing that the author does is to say, okay, let's take a look at what we know so far. So what have the other researchers found? And this is called the lit review. And again, not always called that. Sometimes it's called the background. Sometimes it's called the literature study, whatever. So no problem there. But what you're going to see is you're going to see that the literature overview or literature review is written basically in an upside down triangle. It starts with the studies that have been done. Often they were done longer ago. They're less connected. They are connected to this study, but they're less connected. And as you go on, you're going to get to the most recent work that relates the most to this particular study. So that's what they're doing. And part of what the author is doing is to say, see, I'm not just doing this for my health, I'm actually following a lot of other people who probably know what they're doing too. But what the author then has to say is, but what we still don't know is, and that's the purpose of the article, which might or might not be labeled. But the literature review, here's what we know, here's what we know, here's what we know, here's what we know, and it ends with, uh-oh, but we still don't know this, and that's the purpose. So once the purpose has been given, now we have to talk about this particular study, and that's the methods section. And this is the section that's the most likely to be actually labeled for you. What are you going to find there? Who was in the study? Fancy word for it is participants. What was done? Were there interview questions? I do a lot of interview studies. If so, what types of questions were used? Was a test given? What kind of test? Where did it all happen? What level of the students? How much English proficiency? Things like that. So you'll find out what happened with who, sometimes when. They actually say when it happened. And that's all in the methods section. So after they've described that, what's the next logical step? What they found. And what they found is really in two pieces. The first piece is the raw data, the numbers. If it was quantitative, that means they were going in to count something, which are many of the studies that you're looking at today. They were quantitative. They're trying to count things. Then they're given, you'll see tables with statistics, okay? Don't let that overwhelm you, because I can tell you, even though I've taken 4 statistics courses in my life, I still don't get statistics. I still don't. And yet I'm able to read these articles and make sense of them. I just slightly skip over the pieces of statistics I don't remember anymore. So don't let that stop you. Look for the key sentences, those big ideas about what was found. So you might see table, 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 and then a sentence that says, so what this shows us is, right? You don't have to understand the tables to understand that sentence. So I do qualitative research. I'm going in and I'm gathering images of things. I'm gathering people's words from interviews. And so for me, the data, the findings, are in terms of actual quotes from people or descriptions of things that I saw. But that's only part of sharing what was found, right? The findings, the data. Next comes the discussion, which might or might not be labeled. And the discussion is, so what, right? So how does this connect with what we found before? What does this tell us? And what are the implications? And then finally you have the conclusion, okay? So one thing that should give you confidence is these parts of a research article are always there, whether they're labeled or not. you recognizing where those sections are gives you a lot of power, because now that you know what to expect in a section, you can go in and get those key ideas. You don't have to understand everything. So 3 researcher articles are waiting for you, and then a little chaser text that follows up on the phonemic issues that Spanish readers face when they switch to reading in English. Okay, one more thing before I let you go. I forgot to talk about a tool that you might find useful with students called odd one out exercises. And I actually have an example for you on the handout in the language of Urdu. And so what you would do with your students, and I have this in Urdu just to remind you how it works. The idea is circle the word that's not the same. So you look at number 1 and it's the middle column. You look at number 2 and it's the third column. I had to think a moment. It's the last column, that kind of thing. Why does that matter? Because for a student who's learned to read in a different alphabet, or they've learned to read in a logographic language, starting just to use, especially logographic, they've got this all-at-once processing already. Get them to notice the letters, right? So maybe you've got bet, bat, and they have to find the one that's different. And they're using that all-at-once processing to actually notice a vowel in the middle of the word, which would be great for those students coming from syllabic languages as well. Or an alphabetic language, if it shares the English alphabet, but maybe the vowels work very different, okay? So, odd one out exercises are another great tool for you to keep in your toolbox. Okay, tackle those research articles, do your best, whatever you can do, that's the goal, and then I'll meet you in the discussion and we'll actually apply these ideas. See you then.